Greetings, Ohio Valley. This is Dan Lima with OSU Extension from Belmont County.
And this is Karen Cox from WVU Extension in Ohio County. Thanks for tuning in to Extension Calling, your source for research-based information for the farm, garden, and home.
Hello, Karen. Good to be back again.
Sure is. Got some rain this week, and that's a good thing for growing plants. Hopefully you didn't get too much rain, though.
It was spotty, and I think there were some big differences geographically of multiple inches as far as rainfall goes.
Yeah.
Some people were reporting 1.5 inches, and some people were at 3, and they weren't too far away from each other.
Yeah, it was definitely spotty for sure.
Yeah, too much of a good thing can be a bad thing, but better to be too wet than too dry, right?
I think that all depends on your how much too wet is too wet, you know.
Exactly, and it's still all relative, isn't it? Yeah.
Yes, indeed.
But
this time of year, the plants really need that extra rainfall. They're working on putting down a lot of tissue and getting their nutrients built up so that they can get through the dry season later on this summer. And so it's really important we get a lot of good rain, just hopefully not too much of it.
Yeah, and I think a lot of farmers around in this part of Ohio, eastern Ohio, they got their first cutting in before we started going into this really wet week. The issue would be those guys planting corn, especially in the western side of the state. You know, they've been having a hard time getting into their fields. You know, but like I was talking about, some places got 1.5 inches, some places got 3. You know, a lot of those guys are really having a hard time getting out in their fields. And, you know, we're more than a week into June now, and you're going past the window to plant your corn.
Yeah, it's getting to a very tight, very worrisome time for some farmers. And, you know, for those of you who don't farm, it's really important for you to wait to get out into your fields when you have that great big tractor, because they're really heavy. And if the soil is too wet when you take that tractor out, you cause compaction of the soil, and that compaction can actually take years and years to recover. 7 years just trying to get that compaction undone. And so if you're like, well, why don't they just go out when the field is wet? Well, because it causes a lot of environmental harm. And so they're trying to do what's best for the field and trying to do what's best for the earth. But they're also looking at their tractor payments that they have to make. And so it's pretty worrisome time when you can't get your crop out in the field on time and get it up and running. So hopefully the corn and soybean growers can get some dry fields so that they can go out and get those things in the ground. And hopefully we have enough rain to keep them started once they get in the ground.
That's right. It's a balancing act, isn't it? I mean, you want rain, but you want it at a certain time, and that's not how nature works. But it's a tough life, and you are kind of you don't have much control. There we go. Let's put it that way.
You're at the mercy of Mother Nature.
Thank you.
Yeah, but
this is why it's good to have a second voice on the radio, isn't it?
That's very true. But so even when you look at young plants, when they start off and they're super stressed early on, they're going to have less yield later in life. And so you want healthy, unstressed plants in the springtime so that you can have that stronger yield later on. And that goes for corn, soybeans, as well as grasses. And so we wanted to talk about grasses today and how we can take a look at the growing conditions around them and then look at what nutrients are in those grasses themselves to find out how to best return those grasses to the animals. So we're talking forage quality.
That's right. We're talking forage quality. And, first off, when we talk about soil testing, we say it's one of the most underutilized tools that would help everybody. The next most underutilized thing would be forage analysis, which would probably even be further underutilized, but it's very helpful. So what we wanted to do in this show was just kind of talk a little bit about some of the things you're looking for in a forage analysis and how it can help you. And some averages on what cutting and when, depending on that plant maturity, what the numbers look like, so that you have an idea and you can do some kind of feeding management plan with your livestock. Because again, that's where you're going to make or break your bottom line, is when you know what your cattle need and you're not overdoing it and you're definitely not underdoing it.
Right.
So, how to take a good forage analysis, right? So let's say we get out there, there's that window that Mother Nature gave us, and we get out there and then we make bales. The grass cures. And remember that, what you're doing in making hay is you are preserving what's already there. So depending on the grass maturity, you're going to have different levels of nutritional content. So the more mature a grass is, the more lignin, the less protein, but you have more biomass. So, that it's only going to be highest when it's fresh. And then as it cures, you're obviously going to lose some quality. However, you're going to lose moisture. It's going to be stable, and you're going to be able to feed it later on when you don't have that grass growth, which is the point. But, it's always good to kind of see, where, depending on where you cut, obviously you're going to have different levels of quality, but then that's also going to be reflective of how much you're going to lose in the curing process. So be aware of when you're cutting, make a note of that. So, because there are averages that we can talk about. But when you do a forage analysis on your bales, and I know, Karen, you're a big advocate of doing the forage analysis right before you feed, correct?
As close to feeding as possible, or as close to the point of sale if you are selling your hay. And that's mostly because those dry measurements are, they can change, and so as it is stored, it's going to continue to degrade a little bit. Some of those protein levels are going to go down. Hay will sweat, right? And so those microorganisms can actually consume some of what is in the hay. And so you do have to pay attention to that.
Yeah.
And part of that sweating process, and this is something I want to throw in really quick, even though it's not quite related to forage testing, is making sure that you know the moisture content of the hay when you put it up, because you don't want it to sweat and heat and catch fire. Spontaneous combustion of hay, especially if you've had to put up wet hay, can really devastate a farm. So make sure you are letting it dry completely, and that you know the moisture of your hay when you're putting it up.
That's right. So moisture content, that's how much water is in there. So no forage is going to be 100% dry matter, even though an animal intake nutrient requirements are based on dry matter intake. So just as an example, right, what Karen was saying, if the moisture content of a large bale is above 15% or a small bale is above 18%, there is likely to be some storage and mold problems. So that's what we're talking about. The lower that moisture content is, the more dry matter you have, which actually makes it easier to calculate how much to feed your livestock in terms of how much they can intake so they don't waste. But that's also very important in making sure that hay is stable, right? Because above 15% for a large bale will continue to sweat and metabolize, causing mold issues.
Mm-hmm.
Above 18%, even for the smaller bales, you have a little bit more moisture because that bale has more airflow in there, because those large bales are so densely packed that moisture is just never going to leave. So 15% for large, 18% for small. Those are the numbers you're looking for at the time of baling. So when you do a forage analysis, you will get moisture content. And based on those numbers, you can decide the best way to proceed with that bale. Also, when you store it indoors, it's going to be a lot more stable because you're not getting it wet. If you don't have an indoor facility, the recommendation is to lift it off the ground.
Yep.
Either put it on some like gravel that drains well. I've seen rails that people can put their hay on that just kind of lifts it off the ground, because it would prevent that wicking of the moisture. And then again, that metabolism that's going to further degrade the quality of that hay.
Right, because if you go out on a picnic and you set your blanket down on the ground so that you're not getting wet, you pick that blanket up, the longer it's been in contact with the ground, the more moisture is going to have collected underneath. And especially when you're looking at a heating, cooling process, that moisture is just going to keep collecting underneath that hay. And like we talked about, those microorganisms are like, hey, it's hot and warm and I'm hungry. And they're going to consume some of your hay and reduce the quality of it. Plus, you have more mold issues and potentiality. You can also tarp it, put something over the top of it, and whenever you're stacking your hay, make sure that it is arranged in a way that is going to reduce the amount of rainfall that can hit the majority of the hay. You want it to roll off fairly well, so your bales should be fairly tight so that it doesn't allow the rain to come down and soak into the top of it.
Yeah, so it breaks down like this. In a building is best. Lifting it above the ground is great, and just covering the top is good.
Yes, exactly.
And more, yeah. So I guess if you were to cover the top and lift it off the ground, essentially it would be similar to storing it indoors, for the most part.
Yeah.
So that moisture content, very important, not only for thinking about issues that the hay could have with mold, but also in terms of calculating how much to feed your animal, right? Because what do we say? An animal's going to intake about 3% of its body weight. So a 1,200 pound, and it's always in dry matter weight, not fresh weight. So when we talk about a 1,200 pound animal, it's going to consume approximately 30 to 36 pounds of dry matter. So if your hay is at 90% dry matter, 10% moisture, now it's easier to calculate how much to put in that feed bunk or that hay bring to make sure that your animal's getting the proper amount of food. The next important number to look at is crude protein. So crude protein is basically a measure of how much protein is in that feed. And as we were saying before, the best crude protein in quality is going to be fresh grass, but as you cure, you're going to lose some of that quality. Crude protein is one of those really important things for cattle performance, cattle gains, milk production, reproductive health, all that. And different livestock require different amounts of crude protein percentages, which then will translate to pounds of crude protein if you want to start supplementing with your hay. But you can only make those calculations if you know the numbers. So let's go ahead and talk about some of those numbers. What we like to say is, if we were to just make a general range of low, medium, and good hay, what we see is if you have a hay crude protein percentage of less than 5%, 5 and down is low quality. That's really not going to be sufficient for many animals. If you have like a fat bull, that might be okay. The low quality hay might be something you want to mix with better hay. Medium standard hay is going to be a crude protein of about 9%, and that's going to be non-lactating animals. Animals that, or animals that are not putting too much weight on too fast, animals that you don't want to gain too fast or don't need to gain too fast based on your resources, right? We all want our animals to gain, but hay is considered good at 12% crude protein. And at 12% crude protein, if you look at it from a pounds of protein basis, so if we have 36 pounds of dry matter and it's 12% crude protein, we're feeding approximately 4.3 pounds of protein. And that is enough for a lactating animal, for an animal that you really want higher feed with. Typically, that is going to be a lactating animal because it just takes so much resources for that milk production in the cattle, in the cow. And if you don't give it that protein requirement, the milk quantity goes down. That calf's not going to gain as much. And if you're a cow calf producer, that calf is going to be your source of income. So you do want to make sure that the lactating animals that are nursing that calf do get a good quality hay, or at least enough of a supplement to get to that 12% or higher crude protein content so that the animal is good. A 1,200 pound animal getting more than about 3 pounds and a quarter of crude protein as far as pounds, that's going to be up there with the good too. That's kind of the lower standard of good, but it'll help out a lot.
Right. And you also want to keep in mind that some tests are going to give you adjusted crude protein, and that's simply the crude protein that's had an adjustment made towards its availability to the animal, because the fiber can sometimes tie up the protein and make it indigestible.
That's right. It's a more accurate gauge. Right on. Yeah. I think the next most important thing is to talk about TDN, so total digestible nutrients. And that's the measure of energy in the feed. So it's calculated from the acid detergent fiber percentage. So what you're basically looking at for TDN is the digestible nutrients. So that's going to be the energy for the animal. So just like when we take in carbs, that's the equivalent of the carbs for the animal. And that's going to be a ratio between the non-digestible, the acid detergent fiber, the neutral detergent fiber, which is the amount of fiber that's not digestible. But because ruminant animals can break down these cellulose fibers, there's going to be some that they can break down and some that they can't. And they can get energy from the fiber and the starches in the grass. But TDN is also going to be a measure of quality as well. So again, TDN is measuring total digestible nutrients, and it's more a gauge of the total energy in that feed. For a low quality hay, we'll say it's going to be 45% or lower. Medium, it's going to be about 50%. So half of that hay has energy and the other half fiber. Good hay is going to be 55% and greater. So more than 50% of that hay is going to be energy, and others are going to be a less than 50% ratio of fiber. So those are very important numbers to make sure that you understand and that you can reference. Crude protein and TDN are both going to be very good indicators of quality of hay. And you can also look at the flip side. These are like the good things that we can look at, but less of a bad thing is also a good thing. So, we can look at things like the neutral detergent fiber, which is a measure of the amount of hemicellulose, cellulose, and lignin containing in the forage. NDF is inversely correlated with intake, and NDF levels increase, intake decreases. So, an ADF, so acid detergent fiber, is the amount of cellulose and lignin containing in the forage. ADF is used in digestibility calculations and is inversely correlated with digestibility. So, that NDF is going to limit the amount of feed that animal can take. And ADF, the acid detergent fiber, is going to be undigestible fiber that's just going to pass through the animal and not give them any nutrients out of it.
Right. And so I just want to rewind a little bit for clarity. So with your NDF, or your neutral detergent fiber, cellulose and hemicellulose can be partially broken down by the rumen, by the microbes in the rumen, to give the animal energy. But the lignin, the part of the plant that helps it to stand up straight, is not digestible. And so that's when we start talking about the younger plants versus the older plants, and older plants are more stemmy. That means they have more lignin, which is the indigestible part of that, which falls into your acid detergent fiber, your ADF measurement, because that's a measure of, like Dan said, the cellulose and the lignin. And so the lignin is the non-digestible part, and the cellulose and the hemicellulose are the digestible parts. So just different parts of the plant.
Yeah, and just for a picture of the importance of knowing these numbers, if you have hay that was cut at the lowest level of nutrients, was rained on, kept losing quality as it cured, you only have so much good stuff in there.
Mm-hmm.
You can mismanage hay to the point where you're baling nothing, zero nutrients.
Like I've referred to it before as feeding your cows Cheetos.
No, Cheetos probably has a lot more energy than this, right? It's like
it's just, but it's empty. It's not a healthy meal for your cattle.
But my point is, you can mismanage the haymaking process to the point where your animal is probably not eating very much because that NDF is so high, but you can take that TDN and you can take that protein number and essentially run it into the ground. And yes, there is biomass there, but that's essentially what it is. So if the animal has nothing else to eat but that, It won't eat that if there's other things, but if that's the only thing you're giving your animal could essentially starve to death on that.
Yeah.
So, it's not like these numbers bottom out and cap at a certain point. They go all the way to 0 if mismanaged. But I mean, let's not get too much into that. But my point being that you do get compensated for good hay management. So, one of the things that we always talk about is that starting point, right? So when you're looking at grasses, when you're looking at grasses, let's go from best to least amount of nutrients. But as you go down this list, you're also increasing biomass, which might not be a bad thing as long as you have some nutrients there. Again, you can always, mixing feed, if you know the quality, is a great way to manage your feed and nutrient and have a good nutrient management plan. Or I'm sorry, not nutrient, but feeding plan.
Yes.
But let's go ahead and start with the best of a grass and grass legume mixture. So the best thing you can do is to cut the grass at a pre-head stage, have a flawless curing process where you don't get rained on. So you're going to lose some quality as it cures. But let's say you're drying it to below that 15% moisture level at baling. So when you're baling it, it's less than that 15%. So so bale's not going to sweat too much. You're not going to keep losing quality. But doing so, you can at the pre-head stage. So a lot of guys did make hay back in May this year. And they didn't get a lot, but they probably got some good quality. And you could figure that out by doing a forage analysis. So on average, if you are able to cut hay at pre-head, so a lot of times second and third cuttings are this. So before it goes reproductive and all you have is a lot of very fine grass and not a lot of stems, your crude protein is averaging above 18%. Your ADF is going to be less than 33%. Your NDF is less than 55%. And if we reference our chart here, good hay starts at 12% or great or more. So 18% crude protein falls into good, and ADF less than 33% is going to then obviously have a TDN higher than 55%, which would make it into the good category as well. So, and a lot of these things are correlated. You'll see that you're going to have higher TDNs with higher crude proteins because essentially it all breaks down into nutrients. Crude protein, though, is essential for certain things like muscle build, milk production, more so than just running the metabolism of the cow. Just keeping it alive, essentially.
Oh yeah, it's essential to organ development and so many different parts. Protein is the building block of life.
Yeah. So at the pre-head you got greater than 18%. Early head you're going to have more hay, but you're going to get a range anywhere from 13 to 18%, depending on how much seed heads you have on that forage. If you see nothing but seed heads on the field, you're looking at 8 to 12% at the most. And post seed head, so let's say it's been matured for a long time, and it's starting to dry, right? So you're losing a lot of that. Those components, those starches. You're losing a lot of those proteins. It's less than 8%. Less than 8% can fall to below medium quality hay. So that post head hay on average is not going to be sufficient for a lactating animal. So you want to make sure, and if you're not sure, you can test it. Not saying that you can't feed it to a lactating animal, but you're going to have to do some kind of supplementation with it.
Right.
So, there's it's all about management. You can't like the first thing we said on the show is we're at the mercy of Mother Nature. Mother Nature really dictates a lot of how the grass is growing, and also Mother Nature is dictating when we can go out there, even though we can, I guess we have a little bit more control over that, but getting out there at a responsible time when you don't want to ruin the field, because that's the worst thing that can happen.
Oh yeah.
But even if you don't have super high quality, doesn't mean that you can't use it if you know what it is.
Right.
So having that knowledge, having a basic understanding of that forage analysis can really help you make good decisions on your feeding program.
Exactly. Yeah. And, just like a soil test, you want to make sure you get a good forage test. You want to get that random sample and kind of zigzag through all of your bales. You want to make sure you're using a corer, not just grabbing handfuls here and there, because that's not going to give you an accurate sample. You want to get all the way into that bale so that you're getting the whole variety of layers in that roll. So you want to make sure that you're getting a good, accurate sample when you are doing your forage test. So get a good quality. If you aren't sure how to get a good quality forage test, you can contact your local extension office or your conservation district, or you can go online. There is a website, foragetesting.org, which has a lot of great information on principles for proper hay sampling. And so, just like a soil test, the results that you get back are only as good as the sample that you send in. So make sure you're sending in an accurate sample. Make sure you're sending in separate samples for each different harvest area that you're doing. And if you get your samples back or your results back and you're like, okay, now what do I do? Again, reach out to your local extension office or your local support system and try to, ask, okay, what do I do with this now? What can I use to supplement? My hay doesn't have very much protein, but, I've got calves coming on. How can I supplement so my mamas are healthy? And we can help you find a good supplement that fulfills the weakness in your hay, whether it be, corn gluten or whole shelled corn, depending on what levels you need. And, each of those feedstuffs to support the hay quality, they have, everything's priced differently. So you want to have the lowest input cost possible. And you know what? If you have fantastic hay, and you don't need to buy those extra foodstuffs, you don't need to buy the tub of soybean meal to put out with the hay, because you have great hay. Or maybe it's the other way around, and you really do need to have that extra protein in there. So knowing what you have is the first step in making sure, A, you're meeting your animal's needs, and B, you're reducing your input costs so that you can improve the sustainability of your farm. So really critical.
And just on that line, make sure you're not treating all the animals the same, because separating animals by nutrient requirement is a great way to manage your livestock.
Exactly. Thanks for listening to Extension Calling. This show is a collaboration between OSU Belmont County Extension Educator Dan Lima and WVU Ohio County Extension Agent Karen Cox. If you'd like a transcript of this show, contact us at the office. Also, let us know if you enjoy the show by ranking us on your podcast app.